Bienvenidos. This is Joshua Smyser-DeLeon. You're listening to the Paseo podcast. Thanks for listening or watching us. We're talking about a really interesting story today. And maybe some of you have heard of it, maybe some of you have not. They're called the Pandora Papers. I'm going to let our guests go into a little bit of detail on what those are. We're definitely going to take the deep dive into what the Pandora Papers are. But to give you all a high level view, it is a historic leak. It's the biggest leak ever we've seen of this kind that reveals how global elites have basically taken billions of dollars and hidden them beyond reach in tax havens throughout the world. So to help us make sense of it all, how that connects to Puerto Rico, not just as a colony, but Puerto Rico banks, Puerto Rico celebrities, noteworthy individuals. There are some Puerto Rico connections that were uncovered in these Pandora Papers. So to help us make sense of this all, I've invited reporter Luis Valentín. He reports for el Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. Been doing some really good reporting on the Pandora Papers and the Puerto Rico connections. So Luis, welcome to the Paseo podcast. Really happy to have you with us today.
Hola, Joshua. Thanks for having me here. Happy to be here.
Before we get into the nitty gritty of what the Pandora Papers are and how they connect to Puerto Rico, can you give our audience a sense of who you are? What should they know about you?
Okay, so
it's a big question.
I'm a journalist. I've been doing this for pretty much the past 10 years. And since 2018, I began working with El Centro, CPI, which is a nonprofit pretty much dedicates to investigative journalism here in Puerto Rico. My main topic, so to speak, have been covering the Promesa federal law and La Junta, which you probably have talked or know about, and all the debt crisis and the bankruptcy proceedings that have been taking place these past few years. But I also have covered things related to business, corruption, and money and all that. So that's pretty much my area of expertise at El Centro.
All the fun stuff. All the fun, exciting stuff. Slash like really saddening, I'd imagine. Why did you decide to go into that beat? Why that area of reporting? Because like I was saying, like that can be exciting, the investigative side of it, but it can also, I mean, for me, I'm speaking, I don't want to speak for you, but for me, it's like, how do you not get like frustrated reporting on some of these things? Because we've talked about La Junta before, Puerto Rico's bankruptcy. It's hard for me not to get frustrated talking about it, and you're actually reporting on it. So just why did you decide to go down that path?
Like you do get frustrated, but now that I think about it, I don't remember if I had a choice. No, I'm kidding. I mean, like I remember it was just like I was covering in my old job. There was like a day-to-day coverage of what was going on in Puerto Rico, and at that time, the whole fiscal crisis was exploding, and one thing led to the other. Then comes Promesa, comes the board, comes the bankruptcy. And ever since, I would say 2016, 2017, all of a sudden I found myself covering pretty much these topics. And I mean, I like it. I come from I have a degree in economics. I went to law school. So, some of this stuff I'm able to, relate to easily. But you're right. I mean, like you do get frustrated, and covering the whole Puerto Rico fiscal crisis, debt crisis, La Junta, and corruption on the side. It's it can be very, very frustrating. But we do it, and we hope it it does good to the people here in Puerto Rico.
Well, you've been doing some very good reporting. I mean, I told you this when I reached out to you originally. Like, I'm a big fan of CPI. I would hope a lot of people that listen, and keep me honest here, Luis, I hope a lot of people here are familiar with CPI. And if they're not, you definitely should be. And I know a lot of Boricuas in the diaspora, it's really all English. Spanish, those Spanish muscles don't really get flexed. And CPI reports in Spanish. But there are ways to, one, it's a great way to read some of that reporting and start, a good way to learn. But two, there's also ways to translate that. So you can, maybe it's not a perfect translation, but you can kind of get the gist. But I think that's why it's important to have someone like you on, because for people in diaspora that may not be able to read this reporting in Spanish, it kind of helps us distill what some of these larger issues happening on La Isla are.
I totally agree with the aspect of the importance of publishing both in Spanish and English. And actually at El Centro, we recognize that, and we've been trying to translate most of our stories. These ones in particular, I don't think that translations are up, but we totally agree on the importance of trying to get the diaspora involved and making the stories available in English for people who don't understand or have a tough time with the Spanish version. So we totally agree on that, and we'll try to keep improving.
That's good to hear, Luis, and I'll definitely keep an eye out for that. I know, seriously, I think that's so needed, so needed. And I believe like some of the breaking news. I mean, you all are breaking news on the pretty regularly. I mean, I want to say probably one of the biggest ones that I can remember in recent memory was 2019. I believe it was CPI that broke that story with the governor, with Rosselló, right?
Yes.
The misogynistic text making fun of people that passed away because of Hurricane Maria, that essentially led to one of the largest protests the island has ever seen. Definitely a media outlet worth following. You do some really good investigative reporting. It's a big reason why we're even talking about the Pandora Papers today. I discovered about it. I had known about the Pandora Papers because I'd pay attention to the Panama Papers being released. And of course, when the elites of our world find out that, they've caught on to our tactics and where we're staying, where we're keeping our money, well, let's just move it somewhere else and find a different tactic. So here we are with the Pandora Papers. So give us your best shot. What should people listening know about the Pandora Papers?
Okay, so the Pandora Papers are basically one of the largest leaks of documents, financial documents in history. We're talking about 11.9 million documents, and they come from 14 different providers. And providers are basically law firms, consulting firms, companies that dedicate to set up what we call offshore companies around the world. So we'll get into that in a bit. But just to finish with what the Pandora Papers are. They were published, and the investigation was led by the ICIJ, which is the Investigative Reporters International Consortium of Investigative Reporters, ICIJ. They have done previously these kind of leaks. We remember the Panama Papers was also led by ICIJ. They have had a couple of leaks similar to the Panama Papers, and now comes a new leak, which is the Pandora Papers. And what was basically found with these 11, in these 11.9 million documents is pretty much information on a lot of politicians, power figures, artists, soccer players. I mean, we're talking about a lot of powerful people with a lot of money, and how they move around their money in what we call offshore companies. Now, what is an offshore? It's basically a company that is set up in different jurisdictions, usually for their low taxes or their privacy laws. They don't reveal as much of who the beneficial owner is of these companies. So a lot of powerful people who have a lot of money and companies use these offshore companies to, as you said, move around money and try to, avoid paying taxes or pay less taxes, or avoid giving up too much information or any information whatsoever on who's behind that money and that company. And in the worst case scenario, it could be used for illegal activities such as money laundering, tax fraud, tax evasion. We already discussed that, and just moving, money from illegal activity, drugs, arm trade, you name it. So having an offshore company is not illegal per se. The problem is, what's the purpose of that entity? and whether the beneficial owner of that entity is meeting their tax responsibility in their jurisdictions. And thanks to ICIJ and a lot of other investigative work, we have found that these offshore companies are used a lot for illegal activities, and they raise a lot of flags on how they are used. And eventually what we're trying to get here is how they affect governments that do not receive that money. And that's money that could go to, pay for services, and all of us pretty much who are listening to this, we pay our taxes, we have to comply with, with where we live, and we have to pay it and all that. And all of a sudden it seems like there's a different set of rules for very, rich and powerful people, that they are able to use these offshore companies and move money around to try to avoid or reduce their tax liabilities. So we're talking about $500 billion each year that are lost in government revenue due to offshore activity. So that's a lot of money. And in times where economic inequality is so high, that money is really needed. And a lot of, for example, here in Puerto Rico, we need money for services. We know how bad our government services are right now. So, it raises a lot of questions and an interesting debate on, okay, it's legal, but should it exist as it is right now? Or maybe some changes could come into play, trying to have more visibility into this world, because it's very secret, like shady sometimes, and works like Pandora Papers help shed some light on that activity. So that's pretty much the overview of what the Pandora Papers are and the offshore system, how it works in general.
Yeah, no, that was a great explanation. And I think you hit on a lot of really good things. Are there, in the Pandora Papers, are there things that would constitute as illegal, such as having an offshore company that allows you to do money laundering? But on the other end, the not so illegal part, but ethically questionable, or ethically corrupt, moving around money to avoid paying taxes that would essentially be going into a society that you're a part of, to help other people, but instead you're just solely just trying to help yourself. And honestly, I this is a tricky one, I think, for some people. I think some people were like, yeah, I mean, how are the wealthy, to your point, how are the wealthy able to just hide this money or take advantage of certain relationships or certain knowledge so that they can make themselves even more wealthy, while the working class family, the family that's living poor, the individual that's living poor, is working a full-time job and can barely keep the lights on. So the inequality there, I think, makes people very upset. Now, the flip side of that I'm interested to hear your perspective on, what would you say to somebody that sees the reporting on the Pandora Papers and thinks, well, if I had a lot of money, I'm just using the loopholes in whatever tax code is a part of my country of origin, and using what's available to me in order to maximize my income so that I can take care of myself and the generations after me. What would you say to somebody that asks you that?
You're right. I mean, that's the tricky question, and we heard that a lot after publishing our investigations. We can talk later about. We receive a lot of feedback and comments on that, and like, well, it's legal. What's wrong with it? And I go back to what I said before. Yeah, I mean, you could say that it's legal to have an offshore and to use these tax loopholes that are available to you, but it should be addressed as a matter of public policy. Is that what we want to be as a society as a whole? Yeah, sure, you can look for yourself and your family for generations to come, but at the same time, you don't live in a, sometimes it seems like it, but you don't live in a silo. You don't live alone. You're part of a bigger society, and a lot of that money could actually, if it's well spent and well administered, it could go to, to provide better services to everybody around you, including yourself sometimes. So I mean, you're right. I mean, it goes back to the question, okay, is it right, I mean, to do this? I mean, it's legal, yeah, you can argue that, but am I doing something positive, or is it having a positive effect on society? And that's why I think that question should be addressed to the governments themselves. That should, that's a public policy discussion that each government should have. And that actually, in recent times, we've seen governments of a lot of countries move toward discussing how to, get rid of those tax loopholes, and that, you have tax havens and jurisdictions where, like, companies will move around to try to get advantage of that. Like, you see that the governments are being a bit more aware of, like, yeah, we have this legal system, and each one, has their own set of laws and tax loopholes, if you want to have them or not. But right now, everything is so connected that we should have a conversation as a world, and say, like, hey, how are we going to deal with this? Because, like, it's certainly happening. There's certainly a lot of money, as I said, 500 billion a year. That's, that's insane. I mean, and that's money that is being lost, and many times in jurisdictions, in countries that really need that money to be able to provide decent and essential services. So yeah, I mean, like, I'll people have the right to do whatever the law says it's legal. I guess that's our system, I guess. But I will tell them that, that it's a deeper debate, and I'll try to, and I've done that. I mean, with people that come to me and say, hey, but what about this? This is legal. I'll try to have a conversation with them and try to see if they also agree with, with the aspect of how much money is being, lost to this kind of activity, and whether it should be done in the way that it is right now. I mean, it's not only the tax, question. It's also, there's a lot of visibility issues. Like, there's a lot of jurisdictions that they don't require to disclose anything, and that, that sets up the perfect scenario for illegal activity. You have these systems being used by, drug dealers, traffickers. I mean, like, it's very complicated. So I think it's a deeper discussion than just saying, okay, it's legal, so that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, and we should move forward. A lot of things that are right now outrageous were legal at some point, and and the debate in society led to changes, and I think that's the way we should go. And definitely, it's a question that should be addressed by governments, because I see it as a public policy issue.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of repeat back what I'm hearing, just kind of like, and this is not going to do justice to everything you shared, but the Pandora Papers, they on one level expose the inner workings of how people amass wealth, hide wealth, on a I don't want to minimize this, but on a smaller scale, you get to see, oh, okay, this company or this noteworthy person or celebrity was so, gung ho, rah rah about being for the people and the rich paying their fair share. That might, be using a lot of that language to make themselves seem like they are in favor of policy that would benefit the many and not the few. And with the Pandora Papers, that kind of exposes as a little bit of hypocrisy, a lot of hypocrisy there. In those scenarios. But on a wider scale, to your point, it's less about, hey, look at what they're doing. It's illegal and you should care about it, but more along the lines of, hey, look at what they're doing. It's legal. Can you believe this? That our policymakers have allowed this to happen when you yourself, as a working class person, a working poor person, aren't getting the same resources. And really, as a company or as an individual that employs people, I would think you'd want to pay that money back into society, because that's going to uplift the society that give people access to certain services that help them live longer,
Yeah.
access to higher education, creates a bigger talent pool that you can then
Hmm.
hire and grow your business. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to investing into
Yeah.
society. To your point, bigger issue is about policy. So you had mentioned $500 billion globally gets lost a year
Yeah.
through these offshore companies. Let's hone in on Puerto Rico specifically. Who
Okay.
appears in the Pandora Papers? What is their connection to Puerto Rico? I know you had mentioned banks in your reporting,
Yeah.
noteworthy Puerto Ricanos. Can you give us a little bit of detail on that?
Sure. So when at El Centro, we work with this global investigation. We're talking about the largest journalist investigation and collaboration ever, of over 600 journalists, 150 different news outlets. So it was very big and huge. And in Puerto Rico, at El Centro, we basically started working with this earlier this year. Became part of the consortium, and I was already investigating international banks in Puerto Rico. What are these? Well, these are mostly small boutique banks that offer services to foreigners, not to people who live in Puerto Rico. That's a requirement. They cannot give services to local residents. They only can export financial services. So I was already investigating
Can
these
I
banks.
stop you there, Luis?
Hmm?
Real quick. I'm sorry
Sure.
for interrupting you, but I'm just fascinated because that sounds like some Act 22 stuff.
It is actually, and I
Is
did
it?
investigate Act 22 before the banks.
Oh my
we,
gosh.
we were actually, it was part of a of a we've been doing an investigation series at Centro, which is called Incentivos a Ciega. We're trying to take a look at the incentives that the Puerto Rico government gives out, and what are their results, what is the return on that investment, how is the Puerto Rico government overseeing these incentives, whether people are complying with what we ask them, or whoever receives these incentives. So we've been working with this topic for, I would say, almost a year now, and we just had concluded the investigation on Act 22, which published around March, I would say. And my next topic was international banks through incentive that is called Act 273, which is basically an incentive for international financial entities. It was created the same year as Act 22 in 2012 under the government of Luis Fortuño. And the whole idea was pretty much the same as Act 22. You bring capital from outside, bring it to Puerto Rico. That will create jobs. That will spur the economy, and it will be great. So we found that Act 22 has not been great, and even the government commission studies acknowledge that. And we pretty much found the same with these banks, and how these banks factor into the Pandora Papers. Well, when we get access to the investigation and to the leak, one of the first things that I did was kind of cross what I had of the international banks with the Pandora Papers. And what we found at El Centro and in this investigation was that various international banks here in Puerto Rico show up in Pandora Papers, either by being as intermediaries, let's say offshore companies opening bank accounts in these banks, or using these banks to do wire transfers, basically to move money around, or even the bank owners or shareholders or members of their board of directors were part of the Pandora Papers, having themselves offshore companies and being part of the system. So again, it's not illegal to have an offshore company, but the purpose is really important, because that would say if those offshore companies are being used legally or not. So our investigation, our first investigation that about the Pandora Papers, was about how these international banks have been involved with offshore companies around the world, and how they serve as intermediaries to these entities, and how some of the bank owners, shareholders, and directors or officials also have themselves offshore companies. And many of those bank owners and shareholders are actually Act 22 decree holders. So, they don't pay taxes on their Act 22. They set up a bank, a small bank here in Puerto Rico for their own money, and they don't pay taxes on that income as well. And they are part as well of the offshore system where they don't pay taxes elsewhere. So, that's pretty much what we found. I have to say, yes, there are banks that we found in our investigation that conduct business as usual, and there's nothing wrong with it. But we did identify at least more than 10 different international banks that had some types of legal problems before, or their owners were involved in some sort of investigations. We had the FBI investigating a couple of these banks in recent years. And the other side of that story is the inability of the government to actually oversee these banks. Here in Puerto Rico, we have what's called OSIF, the Office of the Commissioner of Financial Institutions. That's the main entity tasked with overseeing the whole banking system here in Puerto Rico. And we actually interviewed the commissioner, Natalia Sequeira, and when we asked how many employees does the office has to oversee all these banks, all these international banks and their operations, she said that they have 8 employees. We're talking about 8 examiners for 85 banks, including Banco Popular, First Bank, the big banks, and also the international banks. So, I mean, even she admitted that, they don't, she did say that they have a culture of compliance and that they're moving to audit all of these banks right now, which haven't been done in the past, I must say. But at the same time, she says, hey, we have problems recruiting more people. They pay $24,000 a year to these examiners, and they require a degree on accounting or finance. I mean, it's a tough situation when you look at the government, for example, with Act 22, and you have them saying, oh, we want Puerto Rico to become the financial center of the Caribbean, the Singapore of the Caribbean, and and all those things, but you don't have the resources to properly oversee these entities and these individuals. You have a big problem. And right now, those have been the results that we've seen in our investigations into Act 22, and the one on the banks related to the Pandora Papers, which was basically the main investigation related to the Pandora Papers that we published at their center.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, so there's banks in Puerto Rico that specifically cater to people that don't live on La Isla, that aren't Puerto Rico residents.
Exactly. They only can cater to those people. Like, they cannot tend to Puerto Rico residents.
And did I understand you correctly? That's tied to is that tied directly to Act 22? Like, are those banks allowed to do that based off of the Act 22 policy? Or are they doing that kind of in that same thought as Act 22? Like, this is how we can get financial investment.
Like both. Okay. It's part of the package that was passed by the government back then, that includes Act 22, Act 20, Act 273. Gotcha. So a lot of people actually use all of those laws at the same time sometimes. And that's why I said that you do have an Act 22 decree holder being the bank owner of an international financial entity that also receives the Act 273 incentive. So you have like a double dipping there, and it's perfectly legal because that was the way it was set up. Yeah. They wanted people to make, to take advantage of that.
It reminds me of this one story I was reading about recently. I want to say last week, maybe the week before. But it was a person in New York who had been running a homeless shelter. And this homeless shelter had all types of complaints. The people experiencing homelessness there, the living conditions were not well. The food was not well cooked. And I'm not saying they're like, let's give filet mignon. It's like, you know, you're just like the basic nutrients that somebody needs to survive wasn't even done correctly. And then through that investigation, it was discovered that this person had family members on the payroll, but through different businesses. So they were getting grants from the New York government to do that, to offer this service to people experiencing homelessness, but then also created private companies, put themselves and their family members as the heads of those private companies, and were able to pay themselves private sector wages on public dollars. So talk about double dipping, triple dipping, quadruple dipping.
That's insane.
So hearing this story reminds me a lot of that, and especially, and we've talked about Act 20, Act 22, and predatory gentrification on La Isla in past episodes. But for people just tuning in now, and Luis, keep me honest here with these numbers, but it's my understanding that Act 20, Act 22, which I believe were packaged into the same policy, but to kind of talk about them separately, the idea with Act 22 is let's attract businesses, let's lower the corporate tax rate. So if a business was based here in the United States, their corporate tax rate was 21%. Whereas if they were in Puerto Rico, that corporate tax rate goes down to 4%. So they're saving a ton of money. Same thing with similar to Act 22, and actually I'd say worse. That was more focused on individuals, like what we're talking about, and that lowered what's called the capital gains tax from, if you lived here in the United States, 37%. If you live in Puerto Rico, where Luis is based, you're paying 0%. So you got a lot of cryptocurrency people, a lot of YouTubers, the Logan and Jake Pauls of the world moving to La Isla to take advantage of the fact that if they live there, they're not going to pay taxes. And to make this all even better, it's my understanding that Act 22 isn't even something that's available to Puerto Ricans or Puerto Rico residents unless they've lived outside of Puerto Rico in the 6 years of the law being created. So further exclusionary tactics from allowing the people of Puerto Rico to benefit from this policy. So just really, really interesting. And I did not know that about the banks, that they could not serve Puerto Rico residents. That's just, that blows my mind.
And that's another incentive that's usually packaged with Act 2022. So what you will see is like some people, I'm not saying that all of them, but there are Act 22ers who also own a decree under the Act 273 and own a bank, and they set up a bank. And they actually talk freely about it. I remember one case that is mentioned in our story about the Pandora Papers, where he's talking in a podcast like this, saying how good it was for his business to get Act 22, move to the island, you know, really cheap real estate, all that, set up here in Puerto Rico. And then he has so much money that why not? Let's open a bank. And now he has, all of a sudden, he also owns a bank that only pays 4% income tax rate. So, I mean, there's, as you said, I mean, those are things, especially with Act 22, that are not available to Puerto Ricans. Act 20 has a bit of mixed results because there are some Puerto Rico companies who take advantage of the law. But again, Act 22 is only for people who, as you said, are not Puerto Rico resident or haven't lived here for a period of time. That, you know, incentive is not available to Puerto Ricans who live here. So, I mean, it's a bit of a tough situation with the incentives that we have here right now in Puerto Rico.
Well, it's my understanding too, like with those acts, Act 20 for businesses, like there's not even like, I think there is a quota, like you have to have a certain number of Puerto Ricans employed, but it's like, what is it, like 5?
They changed that. Actually, they had
what did they change?
They first had like they were required to hire 4 employees. Then they, you know, eliminated that. Act 22 never had an employment requirement. The bank's law has an employment requirement of 10, I believe, or 4. I'm not sure right now. I could go back and look for that. But the thing is that we have, I mean, we have talked to so many economists, even the ones that are commissioned by the government to conduct these studies to you know, to show the results of these laws, and they agree that it's not enough. I mean, the government of Puerto Rico is not getting enough back on what they're giving these individuals and these companies to be able to, you know, use these incentives and pay so less in taxes. So I mean, it's a really interesting debate, and right now we know that in the legislature they're talking about it, trying to introduce changes, at least some changes, to these laws to make it more a better option for the government, you know, to try to get these people here. I mean,
do you know offhand what some of those specific changes or what like those what are some of those specific changes being discussed in local government? Do you have an idea of what those are?
yes, right now they're asking about they're talking about in the case of the banks and in the case of Act 22, they're talking about increasing the tax rate to 10%. In the case of the employment requirement, they are also talking about increasing the number of required jobs that need to be created, and that these jobs are new jobs. What happened before was like, let's say that I hire a chef, and I have my chef, I have my driver. I'll count that as a new job created. When that job already existed, you know, that person could give services to other people, to other companies, whatever. So right now they're talking about, you know, trying to move requirements toward creating jobs and actually creating jobs and new jobs, and getting a bit back from them in the way of increasing the tax rate that they pay from 4% to 10%, which is still very competitive. If you compare it to other jurisdictions around the world, I mean, like for these people, this is, you know, a very good option to have a 10% tax rate. You mentioned some tax rates that they will have to pay, you know, if they live in the U.S. or elsewhere. So
yeah, I mean, it still cuts the corporate tax rate.
It's a good deal, yeah,
more than half. You know, so it's 10% is amazing. So I think one of the other things that was blowing my mind was the pay. Because the average salary in Puerto Rico, you're talking like 20, 30K, I think, right? So you're looking at
less than that.
Less than that. Okay, so then you're like just everybody's scrapping for the same dollar, as opposed to having policy that goes to help the many instead of the few. It's good to hear that they're at least trending in the right direction, not where it should be.
But at least it's not there.
You know, not even close. But it's good to hear those conversations are being had. You've mentioned individuals a lot in our conversation. So we talked about banks.
Yep.
Who are some notable Puerto Ricans that were named in the Pandora Papers? And actually, you know, if you want to throw out who are some of like some notable like just Latina, Latinx, Latino, Latinas that were mentioned, you know, hey, go for it. I think some of the names that I saw in there were very, very interesting. So give us a sense. Who was named in these papers?
So another investigation that we had the opportunity to collaborate with as part of the Pandora Papers was Latin American celebrities story. And unfortunately for some of our family members, I remember my aunt called me and said, "Oh my God, I can't believe that Shakira was there," or "I can't believe that Julio Iglesias was there, Miguel Bosé, Alejandra Guzman, all those artists, you know, are mentioned and figuring in as part of the Pandora Papers." And in the case of Puerto Rico, and I actually received a lot of backlash with this, it was Chayanne, Elmer, you know, his real name is Elmer Figueroa, but everybody knows him as Chayanne. That was an investigation actually led by El País from Spain. They were doing this investigation on the Latin American celebrities that were, you know, mentioned in the Pandora Papers, and they, you know, we talked to them and we saw that, you know, Chayanne was mentioned there. So El País actually found that in the case of Chayanne, he figured to have a company back in the early 2000s called Fentress. It was an offshore company based in Panama. And he basically could use that company, you know, to sign agreements, to receive money, to be, you know, to get paid pretty much anywhere in the world. And that company was dissolved in 2013, if I remember correctly. El País tried numerous times to get a comment from Cheyenne to, again, it's not illegal to have an offshore company, but just to explain, what's the purpose of the company and whether it met all the tax liability and all the paid taxes pretty much. We never heard from Cheyenne pretty much, and still today we haven't heard from him.
Really, that's such a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know what? It's actually a surprise. I thought at one point
you're surprised by that.
No, because after publishing, I mean, he had enough time to respond. He didn't, and then I thought when everybody was talking about the story and oh my God, Cheyenne is in the Pandora Papers. How can it be possible? And all that. I thought that he would, at least make some comment or react to it. I'm not saying that he'll say, hey, yeah, it's illegal, whatever. I mean, again, it's not illegal, but I'm not saying that. I'm not expecting a whole explanation, of the whole, business dealing. Even though that's what we will hope for, to have some, clarity and transparency on that. But at least some comment, like, hey, I'm aware that this is happening. I'll address it eventually or anything. I don't know. But I really thought that he would, at least react to it. But I don't know. To date, it has not happened. So that was pretty much the most famous Puerto Rican, I would say, that was found in the Pandora Papers. As part of that story, we also identify few other Puerto Ricans, less known. Two of them were government contractors. We tried reaching out to them. Two of them actually responded back. One of them explained that it was a business dealing that he had in Panama with his offshore company, that he actually met all of his tax liability. That was one of them. And there was another one who actually said that he wanted to open the offshore and he did the whole paperwork, but then they said that they were not going to follow through with it. So they apparently never received money, or at least that's what he said. And finally, there was one that never responded back to us, and it was a guy named Manuel Matienzo. He was actually unknown here in Puerto Rico. I don't know if you remember or you guys heard from a very controversial sale of ventilators back at the onset of the pandemic. I don't know how many millions to get some ventilators, and apparently it would take like 2 years to get them. It was a shady transaction. It never went through. And all of a sudden we're conducting this Pandora Papers investigation, and the name of the business owner of that company shows up as having an offshore company. So we never heard back from him. We're still waiting for that. So yeah, that was pretty much the people from Puerto Rico that we identify in these Pandora Papers. Again, this is an ongoing investigation, so maybe in the future, we will, be able to publish stories of more Puerto Ricans or related to Puerto Rico. But those two were pretty much the two stories that El Centro did as part of the Pandora Papers and that relate to Puerto Rico. The use of banks and international banks here in Puerto Rico as intermediaries, and also their owners and shareholders being involved and being mentioned in these Pandora Papers. People from Venezuela, I remember a lot of them. All these people figure to be in the Pandora Papers. And the other story about Cheyenne, which I mean, we're still waiting to hear from him, but led by El País identified Cheyenne as well as other artists, as I said, Shakira, Julio Iglesias, Alejandra Guzman. We saw soccer players, Angel Di Maria was there, soccer coaches, Pep Guardiola was also mentioned. I mean, like it was pretty big in
names.
terms of the names and mentioned in the Pandora Papers. And of course, politicians. I mean, like, I think politicians, and going back to a question that you, or a comment that you made earlier, in terms of like, it blows my mind how some of these politicians who lead the country, but had their money outside of the country. Like, how can you ask the people who live in your country to pay your fair share of taxes if you're not doing it in your own country and you're a political leader? So a lot of political leaders were mentioned in the Pandora Papers, people related to Vladimir Putin, Piñera from Chile, who is being investigated right now, I understand, back in Chile. Ecuador as well was mentioned there. I mean, like, it was pretty big, and a lot of big names, powerful names mentioned in the Pandora Papers.
It's hard not to like read this stuff, and like it piles up to the point where you just don't have trust in institutions anymore. And that's then that's where we get into really dangerous territory, because then you just start tuning out. People start getting upset and take out their anger sometimes on the wrong group of people. And again, I'm jumping around here a little bit, but it reminds me of something that's something that I think is pretty funny, but also upsetting. Here in the United States, we have there's a bunch of kids on TikTok that pay attention to the disclosures that elected officials have to release. They absolutely have to release those as elected officials of their investments, specifically are in those disclosures. So you'll have people that follow Democrats and Republicans in Congress to see where they are investing, and they just invest their money that same way, and they're making money, like no losses, like just making money just by following how politicians that are privy to this information. Think about elected officials investing in tech companies, knowing that the pandemic was coming before we even went into lockdown, making those investments and making lots of money. If only we knew how big Zoom was going to be or Slack was going to be, that we could invest in it. We don't have that information. So again, ethically questionable, not necessarily illegal, but it's there out in the open right in front of us, and it's hard not to lose trust in our elected officials to actually make policy that works for everybody. Where do we go from here? You mentioned that this is an issue of policy at a high level. This is really a story about how policy should be changed. But where does Puerto Rico go from here as it relates to the Pandora Papers?
Yeah. So in terms of of Puerto Rico right now, as I said, there's some discussion at the legislature of revisiting these incentives and the requirements and how the government oversees its incentives and how people use it, and that includes the banks. We know that OSIF, the regulator of these banks, is actually actively auditing these entities, in part of reporting like what we did with the banks and the Pandora Papers and previous reports from other news outlets that have been covering these topics. But yeah, I mean, I think that here in Puerto Rico, we kind of touched on this before. At least there's some discussion that some things need to change. A lot of people want to repeal these laws and get rid of these incentives and this system to try to not have that problem. But what we're seeing from the legislature goes more toward how can we change it so we try to fix some of the flaws of these laws that we already know that they're there and they're so troublesome. I talked about increasing tax rates to these people, increasing the work requirement numbers, and trying to get more out of having these incentives. But again, as you said, I mean, it goes back to the debate. Okay, so should we keep doing it? Should we keep being this tax haven to banks or to individuals or whoever wants to come here and take advantage of our tax laws? So I think that's a deeper discussion that I don't see right now politicians actively pursuing that. I mean, again, there's a lot of money behind, a lot of interest behind these things, and they're politicians. So that's why it's really important, I think, to do reporting like this, because most of the time these things, as you said, they happen, on backstage. You don't see it happening, because you don't have access to that system. You don't have access to those resources. So shedding light into these practices, even though they're illegal, gives you an opportunity to see, hey, that's going on right now, and politicians need to be accountable and explain it. And if they favor it, so come forward and say it, and what that implies as well. So that's something that discussion is something that I'm looking forward to see, to continue to happen, and try to see how we move to changes that are actually beneficial to Puerto Rico. In terms of general, we have seen in the U.S. there's some legislation, I believe, introduced to increase transparency in the way of the beneficial owners and the entities that serve as intermediaries, law firms, consultants that help set up these entities, to try to see who's behind the whole thing. And again, there's the talk about getting rid of the disparities in tax rates, and try to make everything equal to everybody, and try to get rid once and for all of the offshore system as we know it. So again, a lot of talk. Let's see if it translates to real action. That's what always happens with these things, especially public policy, and especially when there's a lot of money behind these businesses. So let's see what happens.
And apologize in advance for any ignorance I have on the relationship between Puerto Rico's elected officials and the people they represent. But I know, like, here in Chicago, if there's an issue that we feel at the federal or state level, we're able to pick up the phone or walk into an office and talk to that elected official to say, like, hey, I want you to support this legislation, or I want you to start working on legislation that addresses this issue and resolves it. Is there a system like that in Puerto Rico? Like, is that accessibility there? Of course, like, I say this from a Chicago standpoint, where we're very democratic, and like you own this office as a taxpayer, so it's yours to walk into. Whereas other states, it's not going to be like that. So like, is there that level of accessibility where if somebody was living in Puerto Rico, they could just reach out to their elected official and advocate for them to address some of the issues that the Pandora Papers reveal?
Yeah, technically, there is access. I mean, there's the phone numbers, and people can call their lawmaker's office, and technically they should have that access. But again, and I'm sure it happens elsewhere, across the U.S. There will be places, and there will be lawmakers that are very accessible, and you could actually bring your concerns to them. And there are others that are not accessible at all, and it's sad, but that's true. I mean, like, so right now, yeah, there's we know that there's the opportunity to raise awareness on these issues, and there have been groups that actively raise awareness on especially, we talked about Act 22 and how bad incentives could be for the Puerto Rico economy and society as a whole. And they do raise these issues with lawmakers, but again, a lot of money behind some of these interests. Many of them are political, donors. Like, you get into the politics of it. So yes, much more is needed to actually push politicians to act and make significant changes to the legislation as we have it right now.
I just have two last questions
Sure.
To ask you. I was inspired over the summer watching the Tokyo Olympics because Jasmine Camacho Quinn brought Puerto Rico our second ever gold medal. Did not have to represent Puerto Rico in the Olympics, could have represented the United States and won a gold medal for the US, but actively chose to represent Puerto Rico. Now she wins the gold medal. I know I'm probably like saying stuff you already know, but she wins the gold medal. Then all of a sudden on social media, I see a lot of this chatter questioning her Boricuaness, her Boricua card. She wasn't born on La Isla. Is she really Puerto Rican? She doesn't speak Spanish. Is she really Puerto Rican? There's also the added layer of that she's Afro-Boricua. So there might be some people saying, well, she doesn't, quote unquote, look Puerto Rican, whatever that means. So I've been really loving just asking our guests, what does being Puerto Rican mean to them? Because I do think everybody has a unique answer that's true to them. And I just like hearing people's responses, whether or not I agree with them or not. I just like giving that space for people to share what being Puerto Rican means to them. So Luis, same question. What does being Puerto Rican mean to you? Now that I've dumped all of that context on you, I know that's can be a loaded question. So, but just curious, what does being Puerto Rican mean to you?
Yeah, I think that's the toughest question so far.
Pandora Papers, tax policy, all day. No problem.
That's easy. Wow, I mean, when I listen to it, and it's great that you brought that example of Jasmine Camacho Queen. I mean, it's so complicated, and I will tell you something. I know what I don't agree with is being so black and white in terms of seeing it. Oh no, because it did not meet these and these requirements, or they want to see it so narrowly. And I think that's the first mistake to actually to think about if somebody is Puerto Rican or whatever they feel like being. So it's so fluid, it's so plural. For example, for me, Jasmine Camacho Queen is perfectly Puerto Rican, and I agree. I mean, you do have to share some experiences, some common experiences, but that doesn't mean that you have to be born on the islands. I've heard people saying, "Oh no, he or she was not born in Puerto Rico." That's not Puerto Rican. Or oh no, their parents, they don't talk Spanish, or the person doesn't know Spanish. I cannot speak what the no.
I mean, you can curse on this podcast if you want. Go ahead. I cursed on the last podcast.
I read a lot of comments on that, and it's especially with sports. I mean, I'm a big sports fan, and this question comes up a lot, and it's been coming up a lot since a lot of time. With the Puerto Rico basketball team, it's the question about, should the New Yorkers be considered Puerto Ricans for the basketball team, for the national team? I mean, what? You have probably, as you said, a guy that considers himself or herself Puerto Rican, that calls himself a Puerto Rican, that actually respects the culture, shares some experiences or whatever, and feels like that, and you're negating that just because it doesn't fit into your definition of what Puerto Rican or Puerto Rican is. I mean, I don't think it works that way. And again, I've seen it a lot in the sports discussion. Every time a player decides to play for Puerto Rico and doesn't know Spanish and hasn't even been here on the island, or doesn't even know where his family or her family is here. I mean, whatever. I mean, they do share some things that make them believe that they're Puerto Ricans. I think that being respectful of the culture is very important. Again, because you have to be respectful with every culture, with with everything. But yeah, I mean, I don't see it as black and white. I see it. It's a very fluid, very complicated, and who am I? Who to judge.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think a lot of times what's missing from that conversation is the reason why there's way more Boricuas in the States than on La Isla right now. We can't have that conversation to say someone wasn't born here when they themselves probably had no choice whatsoever in the decision to leave. Whether that's Hurricane Maria, whether that's earthquakes, financial crisis. I mean, you name it. I mean, we just talked about the average salary. I mean, there's a number of reasons why somebody would not be able to sustain themselves on La Isla. And if we want to get technical, was Spanish, using Spanish, was that always spoken in Puerto Rico? I don't think so.
No.
So if we want to get technical,
and again, it will keep. I mean, what what I really think about this is that it will keep getting more and more complicated as everything is more connected. As you said, more people, leaving the island, or people from outside the island from some reason coming back to the island and haven't been here before. I mean, like, it will get so much complicated, and culture is so complicated, so complex, so unique, so personal. I don't know. I don't have a black and white definition, narrow definition of being Puerto Rican or Puerto Riqueña. Like, I don't believe that they should be one. Like, it's more complicated than that.
No, right on. Okay, last question I have for you. What is the best piece of advice that you have been given as a journalist?
Wow. Ah, the best one. I would say, I mean, there's a lot of good advices. I mean, in terms of how to do reporting that I actually use all the time. But one of the, and it seems minor, but it was really important, especially at the time that I received it. It was when I was beginning to work as a journalist, and I remember I had my friend and colleague, Jesus Avila. He's been doing this for years. I mean, I don't know for how long. And I remember once, like, I was like, there was a press conference. It was not over, but it was almost over, and I was already, like, packing my stuff. All right, I have everything. I have what I need to write a story. Let's go. So fast with things how things are now. Like everything's so fast. And he just, like, approaches me and said, like, stay till the end. All the time, stay till the end, and be sure to get everything. Be on time and stay. And actually that works so much. In all of my stories, there's some points where I feel like I want to, okay, I feel like this is enough, and I stay longer. And that's what I get the story sometimes. That's what I get, like, like the big use out of it, or the detail that I was missing, or the interview that I was missing. I remember one story that we did earlier this year, Cartas de la Quiebra. We went to the bankruptcy. There was a hearing at an office in Atorrey, and we went there to get people there, and we stayed there for like hours, and we got 2 or 3 people, and we were leaving. And I said, "Mom, let me stay a bit." Shows up the person that gives me the whole story. Like, I mean, like the last one. And if you stay engaged, and you listen, that piece of advice, I don't know, for some reason that was the first thing that come up to my head. And it's something that I apply all the time. When I feel tired, when I feel like, okay, that I cannot do this no more, or enough, there's nothing here, I try to tell myself, okay, stay a while, for a bit longer, you can do it. And that's when usually stuff happens. So yeah, you have to stay till the end, and listen to everything, and pay attention to everything, because those are the details that will give you, a different story, at least, or you will be able to tell the whole story. Sometimes we, with the quickness of how these, how news are now right now, and you miss a lot of those things, and I think those are important.
I think that's great advice. And honestly, I do. I mean, I think a lot of time, well, first off, being a journalist is freaking hard. Like,
Yeah.
I've written a little bit, and like I get exhausted writing a page.
Yeah.
I do. I do a lot of writing professionally, and I get exhausted writing that. Let alone having to have the proper sources, understanding the context. Like, there's a lot that goes into it, and you're writing on multiple topics, so it's a lot. And I think for a lot of journalists, it can get easy to get into this cycle of, okay, what are the main points? Okay, I'm hitting the right beats. I can bang out, 500
Mm-hmm.
words, no problem. I have what I need. And I think that's a
Yeah.
lot of times what leads to where we are with a lot of people's distrust in the media, where yes, you have other players at
Yeah.
play and what gets published and what doesn't. But I think of the fast paced nature of our
Yeah.
media cycle, it doesn't allow journalists that space to breathe. And you can start to
Yeah.
develop those bad habits where you're like,
Mm-hmm.
you're getting everything at face value and just running with the story. And then you get
Yeah.
mistakes, you get misinformation, and then you just contribute to this cycle of people saying,
Yeah.
see what they wrote, see how this is, you can't trust it.
Yep.
So great advice. Thank you for sharing
I hope.
that. And it puts it in the context for me too, because sometimes I'll see reporters, like we had Carlos Berrios on the show, the last show, we were talking about Luma Energy, and I'll always see
Yeah.
him tweeting, and he's like, yeah, I'm here, there's like 4 people left, I'm gonna go home. I'm like, why are you still there? Why are you still there? So that your advice, that helps me too. It gives me some good context.
Yeah.
I think that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so for people that are listening that want to keep up with you, want to keep
Yeah.
up with your reporting, Luis, how can they do that? What's your social media? What's the website for CPI? Give us all the things. What should we know?
So you can look for CPI or CPI at periodismoinvestigativo.com. That's investigative journalism in Spanish.com. You can find it in Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, El Centro, and you can find me and follow me at Luis J.O. Valentín. That's my Twitter handle. That's where basically I mostly share my work. So and it's been great to being here and talking to you, Joshua, and people with El Paseo. And I hope it helped understand a little bit of what our work is at El Centro, and particularly the Pandora Papers stories that we did as part of this investigation.
No, I appreciate that. And like you said earlier, the story's not done. There's still a lot of
Yeah.
reporting to do. So hopefully, in the future, you had a good experience today. We'll have you
Sure.
back on to delve a bit deeper. So
sure.
okay.
I'll be glad to do it.
I would love that. Luis Valentín, journalist for Centro de Periodismo Investigativo. Thank you so much for being on the show and helping us make sense of all this complicated policy, making sense of these Pandora Papers. Thanks again for being on the show today.
Thank you.